Hello friends, I'm Dan Alasso, Making History, and this is going to be a slightly longer talk about something that I have read recently. I've been thinking a lot, as you may have realized if you're watching my channel, about freethinkers lately, especially those in the Atlantic world in the first half of the 19th century. It strikes me that they were living in a fraught time, kind of like our own today, and they were trying to create a new way of thinking and of living to deal with it. The revolution of republicanism in America in 1776 had given way to rule by coastal elites in the end of the 18th century and the Alien and Sedition laws. The philosophical radicals of Great Britain had been sort of driven back into the shadows of academic discourse by the French Revolution and by the war between Britain and France. And yet, on both sides of the Atlantic, people were trying to continue the push for freedom of thought and freedom of expression, which is still an issue today. And what I find really interesting is they were often talking directly to the lower classes through penny press papers and broadsheets, and they were often being prosecuted for specifically that. So it's always exciting to me when another historian writes something about these events and these people. And I was interested to discover that Gail Bederman is in the final stages of preparing a book for publication. And better yet, it deals with birth control in the early 19th century, a subject that interests me quite a lot, as you can tell from all the attention that I pay to Dr. Charles Knowlton. Bederman is a member of the history faculty at Brown University who focuses her work on gender and sexuality. She is apparently writing a 2-volume work on the earliest advocates of contraception in Britain and the US. Although I notice in the list that she gives that includes William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Malthus, Francis Place, Richard Carlisle, Robert Dale Owen, and Frances Wright, she doesn't include Knowlton. So that's interesting. In any case, though, the first volume is under contract and is nearly finished, according to her webpage. The second is apparently in the early stages of writing, but this article that I'm going to comment on today, which is called Revisiting Nashoba, Slavery, Utopia, and Frances Wright in America, 1818 to 1826, that was in the journal American Literary History in 2005, is, she says, taken from that second volume. I have to admit, however, that reading this article has significantly reduced my enthusiasm for her project. In this article, which was selected by the Organization of American Historians for its anthology of the best American history essays in 2007, in this, Bederman depicts Frances Wright in a very negative light, in my opinion. The issue seems to be that Wright was not as evolved as we are today and didn't believe all of the things that we do in exactly the right combination. She was, for example, too naively optimistic about America, where instead we are sort of correctly cynical. She believed that enslaved Africans should be freed, but also that slave owners could be convinced to support emancipation by being compensated for the loss of their property, where, of course, we correctly believe that they should have been punished. And when Nashoba failed, Wright moved to New York and continued advocating for her ideals and for free thought, rather than kind of going down with the ship in Tennessee. The article left me wondering, what exactly was the point of Bederman examining Wright's career at all? Was it to explore the past? Or was it to chastise the past and, by implication, the present? So Bederman begins this narrative by describing Wright as someone who, quote, chafed at the British political repression of the 1810s and viewed the US, in contradistinction, as a utopia of liberty. She planned Nashoba accordingly. She wanted to get rid of the US's slaves so the world's only true bastion of liberty could flourish. Okay, so although Wright was very young, 17, when she read Carlo Botta's 1809 History of the War of Independence in the United States, and she was 23 when she visited the US, I think Bederman may be overplaying her naivete. I can accept the idea that, excited by reading and by a series of contacts that she had with elite Americans, she may have imagined the U.S. as, quote, the perfect republic, the opposite of 1810's British political corruption. But I'm not sure that I buy the idea that she, quote, misrecognized slavery as a vestigial remnant of English colonial tyranny rather than an intrinsic part of U.S. political culture. That said, I can also imagine her being charmed by statesmen that she met, such as Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and even Andrew Jackson on her second trip when she traveled with the Marquis de Lafayette, and being taken in by their hypocritical assurances that slavery was a problem that they seriously wished to solve. However, I don't think it's fair to say that, quote, in founding Nashoba, Wright was motivated not by interracial sympathy, but by a profound political, racial, and civic identification with the patriots of 1776, especially Republican slaveholders such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And I wonder what Bederman's motivation is for this assertion and for her entire attitude toward Wright more generally. Bederman says that in 1825, when Wright began her plan for Nashoba, she was articulating a political philosophy that was radical in Britain, but, quote, absolutely mainstream in the US. She describes the philosophical radicalism of Bentham, Godwin, Priestley, and Wollstonecraft, which had been suppressed since war had broken out with revolutionary France. But I don't think that from a US perspective, Wright's, quote, political enthusiasms were quite ordinary, even old-fashioned, and echoed revolutionary-era republicanism. Bederman cites Halevi's The Growth of Philosophic Radicalism to support this claim, an old book which seems to relate more to the British element of her point, but not necessarily, I'm sure, to the US element. But I'll check it out and report back to you. As a young woman, Wright was not allowed to enter Glasgow University as a student, but her uncle, James Milne, did get her access to the library for at least 3 years. Bederman also mentions that, quote, Wright also imbibed an anachronistic 1790s version of Anglo-American republicanism from a woman she soon began to call mother, Robina Craig Miller. In 1795, Miller, related by marriage to Wright's uncle Milne, had settled in Philadelphia as part of the great emigration of radicals who, like Joseph Priestley, fled to the U.S. to escape anti-Jacobin repression. Miller and her husband had been part of Benjamin Rush's Pennsylvania circle of British expatriates until John Miller's unexpected death 18 months later had forced Robina to return to Scotland, where she continued to see herself as a patriot and correspond with Rush until he died in 1813. This is an interesting lineage of radicalism that I should explore further. The number of radicals who crossed the Atlantic in the 1790s deserves a closer look, I think. Probably the United Irishmen do as well. Bederman suggests that Wright may have been influenced by Miller to blame Britain for American slavery, mentioning that Jefferson had tried to blame King George in his long list of royal offenses, but slaveholding interests had prevailed on him to excise that passage from the Declaration of Independence. Is it that difficult to imagine an older Jefferson doubling down on this claim in conversation with Lafayette and the charming young woman that Lafayette brought with him, Frances Wright? Bederman chides Wright for optimistically reporting that the U.S. government had eliminated the Atlantic slave trade and that many northern states had abolished slavery. But aren't these positive developments? Are we so obsessed with binary either-or choices that we have to define people as either saints or as villains? Bederman then tries to describe Wright as believing, quote, that American Negroes as a class, like ignorant European peasants, were intrinsically inferior to America's white citizen philosophers. This seems particularly unfair to Wright, who seems, from other accounts that I've read, including her own writings, to have believed something close to Robert Owen's environmental determinism. If enslaved people in America had been prevented from learning to read and had been subjected to the very worst conditions, who would reasonably expect them to be philosophers? Bederman does at least admit that this, quote, inferiority stemmed not from intrinsic racial character, but from the lasting degradation caused by slavery. If this is the case, why bother to try to portray Wright as a racist? Perhaps it's unfashionable today to be a well-meaning white person, or to say that lack of access to opportunity actually results in people having different levels of understanding. But the way she's painting this picture is a little bit unfortunate, I think. And she then moves on to make light of the interest that Jeremy Bentham took in Wright and her project. Bederman also seems a bit annoyed by the fact that Wright's anti-slavery sentiments were irreligious. There were other white women interested in abolition, she mentions, describing the literature they wrote, the petition drives, and the fundraising conducted by respectable ladies in Britain during Wright's youth and then in America in the 1830s. Bederman says, quote, there is no evidence that Wright knew or cared about any of these. Worse, quote, unlike most other female abolitionists, Wright scorned religion as irrational and unnatural. Is this the real problem? Bederman then narrates Wright's 1824 to 25 visits to Washington, D.C. and to Monticello, where she discussed colonization with Jefferson. She also spent several days with James and Dolly Madison on their plantation, and that visit apparently supported the idea that Wright developed that, quote, Americans sincerely wanted to rid their country of slavery but lacked the means. Sometime during this year, she also seems to have discovered the Rappite Harmony community in Indiana, possibly as Robert Owen was purchasing the town to begin his own experiment of New Harmony. Both Owen and Wright seem to have been convinced that what they called the united labor that was practiced by the Rappites was so much more effective than the typical organization of work in the American economy that its adoption would unlock levels of production that would not only support Owen's cooperative society, but, as Wright believed, allow enslaved people to easily work their way to freedom. Bederman seems critical of Wright's belief that slaveholders should be offered an emancipation path that, quote, would not cause them any pecuniary sacrifice. This may seem very odd to us now, after the Civil War, but there was extensive precedent at the time. As Thomas Piketty has recently documented in A Brief History of Equality, Britain and France both compensated slave owners, basically paid reparations to the slave owners rather than to the slaves when they eliminated slavery. And Bederman also faults Wright for not concerning herself that the land that she acquired with the help of Andrew Jackson had been part of a forced cession by the Chickasaw in 1818. And again, I kind of get this, but it also seems a little bit anachronistic to me. Wright was unable, of course, to attract subscribers to her plan, so she poured $10,000 of her own money, equivalent to nearly $300,000 today, and about a quarter of her total assets that she had inherited, into this plan. She bought somewhere between one section of land, 640 acres, and two, 1,280, accounts differ, along with 8 slaves. Although she continued to hope that people would begin supporting the project once she got it off the ground, this, of course, turned out not to be the case. Although Bederman seems to insist on portraying everything Wright did in the worst possible light, she may be correct in saying that this disappointment broke the rose-tinted glasses with which Wright had been viewing America and turned her into, quote, an American radical. In December 1826, Bederman says Wright, quote, publicly abandoned both her plan and her now shattered faith in the U.S. as utopia by signing 3 deeds that transformed Nashoba from a privately owned model farm into a utopian community and philanthropic trust. And for me, this doesn't really seem to track. She did continue Nashoba as a cooperative community, like New Harmony, and didn't turn it into a corporate farm or something. Bederman seems to object to the fact that 8 enslaved people were not immediately emancipated and made members, in equal standing to the whites who had presumably contributed some funds. According to the trust, the goal was still for the enslaved people to earn the funds to purchase their freedom. So despite the lack of large numbers, Wright and her partners seem to have continued to believe that they would be able to achieve this goal, albeit on a smaller scale. Bederman argues that, quote, even in this new utopian phase, Nashoba was no egalitarian interracial community. And she describes Wright as being, quote, as unwilling to lose her substantial monetary investment as any other slaveholder. So really, is that fair to compare Frances Wright to any other slaveholder of the South? She then further describes Wright as endorsing the trustees' quote, quasi-Godwinian free love regime. Although she does admit that Wright was in Europe trying to recruit new supporters while the sexual scandals at Nashoba were unfolding. Finally, she criticizes Wright's attack on the institution of marriage and her proposal of, quote, racial amalgamation, miscegenation, as the solution to the U.S.'s race problems. Now, miscegenation is an extremely charged word these days, so I kind of wonder what motivated Bederman to use it. Is it that ridiculous to suggest that having children together might break down the walls between peoples over time? It was certainly shocking at the time, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that this should count against Wright rather than for her. Bederman then reports that when Wright returned to Nashoba in 1828, she found the community in chaos. After several months that Bederman says Wright spent, quote, mourning the utter demise of her plans, rather than perhaps trying to fix the community, quote, she finally concluded that no useful political work could be done in rural Tennessee, delegated the care of Nashoba and its slaves to other hands, and moved on to other types of radical projects. The citation for this kind of derogatory narrative includes Laurie Ginsberg's 1994 article, The Hearts of Your Readers Will Shudder, which I'll review shortly. Spoiler, I wasn't that impressed with that either. And Ginsberg certainly fits into this theme of bashing freethinkers, I think. Almost lost in this depiction of her subject as kind of a feckless dilettante is the mention that, quote, in January 1830, Wright chartered a ship and, at great personal and financial cost, transported them to Haiti. Once there, she emancipated them. However, having mentioned that, Bederman spends almost no time on that. Her goal in this article seems to have been to skewer, quote, utopian fantasies of Nashoba and, quote, our desire to see heroism. Our problem, I think she concludes, is that, quote, we long to find some project, some insightful radical who escaped the painful racial realities that have always been interwoven with Americans' Republican love of liberty. Frances Wright did not succeed in freeing all of America's slaves. So apparently she should be written off as a naive dreamer or should be condemned as a hypocrite. Some of her ideas were wrong. So apparently there's little value in open-mindedly looking at any of them. Is this how historians are supposed to engage with the past now? Is this what the 2 volumes of Bederman's forthcoming opus are going to do? If so, is it going to be a contribution to the growing history of birth control advocacy? Or just several hundred pages of complaints about how wrong people in the past got it, even when they tried to improve their societies? I hope it'll be the former, but I'm going to have to wait and see. And in the meantime, I hope people found this a little bit interesting. I will have more to say from time to time about the scholarly articles that I'm reading about free thought in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So thanks very much for listening, and I will see you again very soon.